All right, we are here back on Play It Forward with filmmaker, writer, director Nick Thompson. The film is Skagit. Thank you for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. I really look forward to talking about Skagit. It is experimental horror. Would you like to introduce yourself and or the film prior to starting?
Yeah, sure. My name is Nick Thompson. I was born and raised in Seattle, where I still live and work as a filmmaker. And yeah, Skagit is an experimental horror film that I wrote and directed, basically about four friends who head up from Seattle to the Skagit Valley, which is about an hour north of here, for a weekend vacation. And once they're there, they all sort of start to slowly lose their minds and gradually get pulled into these alternate realities, all connected to some mysterious force in the valley. And we shot the movie way back in November 2018. And took a long time to edit and then film festivals, and now we're finally about to release it publicly. So yeah,
Awesome.
it's been quite a journey.
Congrats. Is it your first feature?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, it's a huge accomplishment and a huge undertaking. The film is beautifully shot. There's like ridiculous landscapes. It's incredible. It's really cool looking scenery. I mean, amazing. And that said, the first question to play it forward, I mean, it is an experimental horror, so we're gonna set up what that means. And from an experimental kind of perspective, I think we're saying, there's not like a straight linear narrative. There's a lot of kind of experimentation with time going back and forth and skipping and some, incongruity. I mean, I guess how would you say what is the experimental part mean in the experimental
Well,
horror?
I mean, yeah, it's definitely, I mean, I think people who are really into like experimental films, avant-garde stuff, might not call Skagit that experimental, because it's definitely kind of straddling that line. I think that yeah, I definitely didn't want there to be any sort of one answer to everything, or one interpretation of the movie that is correct, and intended it to be this kind of journey that one experiences in the moment while you're watching it, really kind of an emotional, visceral journey. And I think at the outset of writing it, I really wanted to make something where sort of the form of the film was inseparable from the plot of it, of what was happening, in the sense of like, whether it be sort of a visual style or look to something, or yeah, or playing around with time or dialogue being asynchronous, of they're not being able to say, oh, this is what's happening in the plot, and then this is just a style the director applied to enhance it, but rather they're one and the same. This story can't really be explained outside of this movie, if that makes sense.
I think so. I think you're yeah, I mean I get the it's not just a stylistic thing to explain a narrative. It's kind of a an attempt to use images more than dialogue to convey emotion.
Yeah.
And yeah. Um and so that said, the first kind of question in terms of the themes, the themes that Skagit is exploring is there's certainly a theme of I mean, there's just the big theme of like something taking over people's mind and sense of reality, and then the paranoia, the isolation, the maybe separate agendas and kind of perspectives, and then this desire to come together as one, and those things kind of being in conflict. Um,
Mhm.
because sometimes they're happening, sometimes they're not, and these people are kind of, um, portraying life in the way of sometimes people have their individual agendas, and sometimes those agendas are to seek something from someone else. So is it truly a desire for union or coming together? from a place of love, or is it coming together from a place of want? So those things, those lines are getting blurred, and that theme is getting explored again with the isolation and and the nature and sort of the landscape is interesting and love is very beautiful. And the colors are very saturated often, until that, like there's that one part in the movie, but they're typically very saturated and lovely, and yet they're kind of dark and mysterious and brooding like the characters, and I guess complex. So overall, I'm trying to kind of sum up this vast palette that you're exploring. But I think it's sort of the underbelly of humanity, these dark feelings that we have, and fear being a big one, and mistrust. So in terms of an isolation and what is real, in terms of all of that as kind of a range of colors within a color scheme, um, where did the inspiration come from your own life experience? Do you think that Skagit was the output of?
Yeah, I mean, I first started thinking about the movie way back in like 2015 when I was kind of in my early mid 20s. And I was actually living in New York at the time, and the movie started totally differently as this sort of inspiration from this house that this friend had up in New England, much more kind of stereotypical horror movie setting, and thinking more of a kind of straight horror movie as the style. But then I just, I didn't really have the motivation or resources to make it. And so I took the time to kind of think and realize, why don't I make this the movie I really want to make, which would be set in the Northwest and more experimental. And so it totally came from, me and my friends in that time period. I think I wanted the characters, even though the movie is set in the Skagit Valley and called Skagit, it's very much meant to be these characters who are from Seattle and who are, visitors to the landscape. And so, yeah, it really was supposed to be about the group, that yes, there's this main character, Elsa, but she's not that much more central than the other three. And yeah, so exploring the group dynamic, and their individual relationships with one another. And I think just growing up here, I had a lot of friends who, we remained very close and tight knit for a long time. And that was, and it's an interesting experience to have in a city that's kind of changing very quickly and has a lot of people moving here from out of town. So me and my friends would meet people who would say, oh, you're the first person I met who's from here. And it's like, to us, most people we knew were from here. And so there was so that was kind of part of the experience of these people who are kind of drifting in this period of their life and unsatisfied, and have this intense bond both with their friends and also with the landscape of, growing up in Washington State in the Northwest, and really kind of identifying with the landscape and with the kind of dark and light side to it, of it being very beautiful and also very depressing. And so, and feeling conflicted about both of those, of both this kind of attachment to both the landscape and their old friends that maybe was good in some ways and bad in others. And the Skagit Valley was just, it's a place that I've spent a lot of time driving through, knew to some extent, but really as a visitor. That it's like a lot of the rest of Western Washington, but I think just, even more kind of enhanced, of being even more beautiful, but also a little more dreary and creepy. And also not so far from the city that, the point was less a really realistic physical isolation, like they're truly in the middle of nowhere, rather than it's rural, but it's really more of this kind of more dreamlike and personal isolation, is the idea.
That's
So
great. No, I totally can understand and relate to that. I mean, I think, some of the key words that you used was, dissatisfied or unsatisfied in the early 20s, kind of lost reconciling identity. I mean, certainly
Mhm.
identity is a big one in the depressed, I mean, what is it? How many days out of the year is it raining in Seattle?
Um, I don't know. It's definitely cloudy most days, I would
I
say, other than the
mean,
summer. But
it's ridiculous. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of the, kind of that grunge Nirvana came from Seattle, right?
yeah, we're from the region. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, it's just has that depressed angst. I mean, the angst is, teenage angst is everywhere. You can find that, or adult angst, or that it morphs into. But I think that kind of restlessness is really, evident in the themes that you're exploring in terms of the difficult side of being human, and what are those emotions, and how do we deal with those emotions that are can be overwhelming, and possess us, right? I mean, essentially, there's some possession going on. And,
Yeah.
you know, often our identity is skewed by our emotional possession, like whatever those emotions that possess us. I think there's a lot of horror films that kind of, I know there's, Japanese culture, there's often like if you're like too greedy, then you get possessed by greed and you become this greedy vampire kind of thing. So
Mm.
those, kind of morality tales built into the horror of it. And
Yeah.
that leads me to kind of, we were talking about it a little earlier, but how do we, you went into such a um dark place. I mean, it's a dark place, and there's intense palettes of emotion getting thrown around from one scene to the next scene to the next scene to the next scene. So, and those themes, for me as I watched the movie, it was like really the isolation, the interplay between, community and kind of everybody taking care of one another, and then at the same time, whoa, we're like at odds. So, and paranoia and the fear and the love, so if those are like some key themes that you resonate with, or others that you maybe, explored, what what do you come away with as a viewer, or at least because you experienced it both as a viewer and then as a maker. So,
Mhm.
in your experience, what were some of your own takeaways from the process?
Um, yeah, I mean, it's it's hard to kind of, yeah, when it's such a long process, it can be hard to kind of differentiate, yeah, viewing it later on versus writing it, or coming up with the ideas, I mean, I think, yeah, it's definitely like you were saying with like the emotional possession. I mean, it was definitely intended that, um, that each of these characters is kind of reacting differently to whatever this kind of supernatural power is, because of who they are, right? And so they don't all react the same way. And I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, I think as a viewer, it definitely, became this kind of bittersweet ending in a way without giving too much away, where which I think was probably there in the writing, but maybe came out more in the editing. I think that um I think I definitely, like, now it's been so long, I can't watch the movie without having a lot of criticisms of it, of course. And so it's which, I mean, I think it would be a problem if I didn't, because if I hadn't grown as a writer in, 7 years, I think, um, so yeah, I mean, I see what I was trying to do, but I would like, in my next movie to definitely be more specific and more in depth with each of the characters. I think I had a lot of ideas for Skagit, and I wanted to kind of operate on instinct to some extent, and also to give the actors opportunities to kind of make their decisions, particularly since I was so inexperienced. Um, but I think, I think I realized that, yeah, there's a lot of stuff I would have liked to kind of draw out more, that, maybe there wasn't, an opportunity to, or even to go, yeah, or even to go darker. I mean, I think that's the other thing with when you do this horror stuff, it allows you to go darker in a way, but it also allows you to kind of, put up this kind of style and genre in front of it, that rather than having to see something really as like really real, how people would act or react. So it kind of, I don't know, it kind of goes both ways.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you can hide behind the genre.
yeah, yeah.
Well, look, I mean, it's, to make a feature at any age, especially as one of your first features, I know it's very ambitious, and when we bite off things that are ambitious, we're just, going on sheer instinct. And trust me, I know what that's like. And it takes a lot of time to really refine and hone in the craft. And, you got to make a mess to be able to clean it up. So, totally understandable. And yet there is just from forget the execution of it, right? Just the the understanding, like to you, what is the biggest theme going on in the film?
I mean, it's kind of a coming of age story. I mean, really, I mean, like you're saying about teenage angst becoming adult angst. I mean, it's totally, yeah, it's totally these people are, technically adults, but are still, yeah, feel like kids in a lot of ways and are still kind of, yeah, feel like they're drifting. So yeah, I really think, I guess, I don't know how I would boil it down into like a word or a sentence, but I think it is that, I mean, it's kind of that sense of home or origin and the conflicted relationship that they have with that, both in where they live, the larger region, and also their old friends. So
Well,
yeah.
that's super, helpful, and I totally get that. And I think when you say it's a coming of age story, is the thing with coming of age is that you're confronting your insecurities and all these insecurities and how you've built your identity. And we often build our identity around who our friends are. Like, oh, I've got to be friends with this guy because he's cool, and I want to be cool like that, and this is what he does to be cool. I'm going to do this to be that. And so as those relationships start to disintegrate, right? Because maybe we've seen, oh, that dude's not so cool, or person or girl or whatever, chick, they, uh, whatever it is, they're not that cool. So what happens? And oh, maybe they're out for themselves. And oh shit. And now I'm starting to get paranoid about who they are, who I am, and that search for meaning.
Mhm. Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
how do
totally.
you how do you how do you walk away from that? You know, not
Yeah.
being how do you walk away from that groan?
Right, right. I mean, I think, and yeah, I think that, I mean, when I was making the movie, when I was like writing and shooting it, I definitely, recently kind of, yeah, experienced a sort of my friend group kind of breaking apart. And and I think that then has happened again since then, and just sort of, coming to that kind of acceptance that there is not some kind of, plateau of adulthood that one reaches, and it's always this kind of gradual process. And I felt like that this time period of the age that these characters are was just kind of the heart of that period, though, it can start earlier when they, leave high school, and it can then keep going. But yeah, I mean, it was something that was on my mind at the time for sure. And yeah, having to kind of, yeah, find out your own identity by yourself, and also getting used to, being alone, and making your own happiness, filling your own time, that I think, is something a lot of people maybe kind of are forced to figure out the hard way when they're adults. After, yeah, after like you were saying, their identity being so built on their social life, you know. So,
Yeah, I love that. That's deep. That's deep because it's real and it's real for everybody. And, the words that you strung together are really powerful about some people have to learn the hard way of alone, being alone.
mhm,
And yet there's so much there for us when we are, because, oftentimes people misconstrue being alone with being lonely. And
mhm,
those are, absolutely not copacetic by default. So,
right.
it's a really, really powerful place when we can mature as people, as adults, into a place where we're okay being alone, you know? And your film is a part of that process by going through all those dark landscapes, which are blurry and, you know,
Mhm.
fucked up, and just you don't know. It's so hard to tell what is external reality, but when you are alone, you get to cultivate the stillness and trust within to trust that place of knowing.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. And I mean, I think that that comes out, maybe particularly in the case of Elsa, the main character, of that she feels a little bit more outside, like a little bit of an outsider, to kind of the experience in some ways, and is kind of the observer, realizing sort of what's happening maybe before the rest of the people in the group are consciously aware of it. And and I mean, yeah, and the other big element of the movie is their relationship with the landscape. And yeah, I think that myself certainly, but also a lot of other people from here, often can feel, yeah, not quite at home in a lot of other places in the country. I mean, I think that, yeah, just the climate can feel so different, so much more mild rather than, more continental. And that, you realize leaving here that, um that's important to you, and that it's kind of a part of, yeah, a part of your, emotional equilibrium, so to speak. And yeah, so I think that that's the other thing for the characters. And that also comes out especially, which isn't really in the film, but it's kind of on the margins of it, of living in a city that's rapidly changing, and that's not that large or old to begin with, so it can feel like a large percentage of it can be erased very easily. And that's happening sort of in the larger context that isn't really explicitly discussed in the movie, but I would think that people would be thinking about it, of, climate change, of just like the climate and landscape in general, and the landscapes that we and climates that we all have attachments to, or are used to, feeling like that is sort of being upended, or is no longer something people can count on. And that impending sense of disaster as well, so.
Yeah, no, thank you for mentioning that. I think that's, totally relevant and important to everything that you're talking about, and coming of age, and the stability, right? What becomes a stability within a changing landscape, changing an ecosystem,
Mm,
changing, everything's change. How do we remain in a place of confidence, security, home?
totally. Yeah.
Nick, last question, I'll play it forward, is how have you been personally changed since making Skagit?
Oh man, I mean it's yeah, Skagit was kind of the, main thing for so many years of my life, and then has continued as a sort of, more minor thing that I'm still working on after that. And so, I mean, I think for me at the time, it was very much, I had grown up wanting to make movies. My parents make movies as a living. I went to film school for a little bit. And then, like a lot of people, I was no longer sure if I wanted to do that anymore. And so it was kind of this return, and also a new thing to, committing myself to making movies, but also in a larger sense, art. And and so that was really valuable of, just kind of always trying to stay one step ahead of myself so that I couldn't back out and, fully throwing myself into that. And so, it makes it a little easier to do that a second time. On the other hand, you also know there's things that you aren't really willing or hoping to experience again. So trying to figure out ways to make the second time different. Um, and and yeah, and in some ways, my next movie will be exploring similar themes, but in a more realistic way, not non-experimental at all. But and so yeah, kind of I definitely I learned a lot about the screenwriting process. And it's interesting to see when you kind of grow over the course of one film because it takes so long. And also because you need to do that in any filmmaking process. It's like I felt like by the editing stage, I had such a better grasp of the structure, how to make the structure strong, than I did in the screenwriting. But there were problems that that I just couldn't fix by then, and so realizing, you know, how to go into it a second time, doing that again, and yeah, I don't know. It's just
Well, wait a second, man. I'm not going to let you get off the hook because technically, technically you're sharper. You've grown, you've matured technically. It sounds like you're committed to being a filmmaker now. That sounds like that's kind of also been solidified. But going through these themes, man, going through this growing
yeah.
process, going through this coming of age and coming of age while you're making a movie about coming of age and now having come to a different age, how have you been changed?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think it is interesting. I've been thinking about that lately because I've been writing a movie where the last part of it kind of takes place when I was writing Skagit. And so kind of like I was saying earlier, I mean, of realizing that process of growing up and working on yourself and also your friends changing is always continuing. And you can always look back at it. Um, yeah, you can always look back at it from one time and you're looking back at that time from another. And yeah, so there's certainly, um, yeah, I mean, just kind of that certainly happened. I mean, I'm thinking about how that relates to themes of the movie. I mean, I also think that it's interesting. I moved back to Seattle to make Skagit, and now I've been here 6 years, continuously. And it's interesting to feel like, being somewhere with more of a kind of artistic purpose that also bleeds into work as well, and being sort of a little bit just more confident and grown up, myself. It's you experience the place differently, and I think that I experience it more positively now than I did when I was younger, and I felt like so much of my happiness was kind of built on both my social circle and also the larger events of the city, which are still important to me and are still should be important to everyone. But I think that it is different when you kind of have your own purpose